dreamed of, the family, the children, the quiet joy of holding your own baby, had an expiration date? Not years away. Not someday. But 60 days from right now? This is the story of a 21-year-old girl who walked into a doctor's office with a tote bag and a prayer, and walked out with a choice that would change everything she thought she knew about love, desperation, and what it really means to be brave. Stay with me. Because this story, I promise you, is one you will not forget. The waiting room of the Manhattan Fertility Clinic smelled like lavender and antiseptic, that strange mix of comfort and clinical coldness that only hospitals manage to create. It was the kind of place where desperate hopes were quietly dressed in expensive decor, where the ache of longing was softened by the hum of central air and the distant sound of a water feature in the corner. Abigail Morrison was 21 years old, and she had no business being here. That was the thought running through her mind as she sat in the leather chair, clutching her canvas tote bag tightly to her chest, almost like a shield. Around her, women sat with their husbands, whispering softly, holding hands, eyes full of quiet anticipation. They were older. They had been trying for years. They had earned this place with their heartbreak. Abigail was 21. She earned a bookkeeper's salary of $32,000 a year. She had used almost the last dollar on her credit card to pay for today's consultation. She had never been in love. She had never been kissed the way the movies promise you will be kissed. She had saved herself, her whole self, for the right person. And yet here she was, being told by the universe that her body had not saved itself for her. The nurse called her name in that professionally kind voice they all seemed to learn in medical school. Abigail stood on trembling legs. The hallway she walked down was lined with framed photographs of smiling families, mothers and fathers holding brand new babies, children with gap-toothed grins, families caught in golden hour sunlight. Every photograph was a small, beautiful punch to the stomach. She wanted that. She had always wanted that. The kind of family where Sunday mornings smelled like pancakes. Where someone held your hand during thunderstorms. Where you were someone's whole world, and they were yours. Dr. Julian Hartwell stood when she entered. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 34, with dark hair that fell slightly over his forehead and sharp gray eyes that missed nothing. His white coat was worn over what looked like an extremely expensive suit. Everything about him communicated precision, control, and the quiet authority of a man who had never once doubted himself. "Miss Morrison. Please, sit." His voice was calm in the way rivers are calm, deep beneath the surface, moving with great invisible force. He opened a manila folder. His expression did not change. But she noticed, she was the kind of girl who noticed things. His jaw tightened, just slightly. Just for a second. He told her what she already half knew but had prayed wasn't true. The hormone levels. The diagnosis. Premature ovarian insufficiency. A condition that, in her case, was progressing. Based on your results, he said gently, you have approximately 60 days during which natural conception remains possible. After that window closes, it will become extraordinarily difficult without medical intervention. And without intervention, we're looking at permanent loss of natural fertility. 60 days. The words fell on her like stones dropped into still water. She felt the ripples move through her chest, her stomach, her throat. 60 days. 2 months. 8.5 weeks. She was 21 years old, and someone had just told her she was running out of time for something she hadn't even started yet. She heard herself whisper, almost to nobody, I have 60 days to become a mother. After that, I never get the chance again. Then, because fear does strange things to people, because the human heart under pressure will sometimes split open like a piece of overripe fruit, she said the thing she had never told a doctor, or a stranger, or anyone at all. I'm a virgin. Her face flooded with heat. The words had just fallen out of her mouth before she could catch them. She pressed her lips together. Waited for his reaction, for the raised eyebrow, the barely concealed smile, the professional pity. Julian Hartwell's expression did not change by so much as a millimeter. "I understand," he said. "That adds complexity from an emotional standpoint. It doesn't change the medical picture. IVF does not require intercourse. If we can retrieve viable eggs within your window, you have options." She wanted to cry. Not from sadness exactly, from the strange, raw vulnerability of being seen so plainly by someone who remained so unmoved. "I'm a bookkeeper," she continued, the words now tumbling freely. "I make $32,000 a year. This consultation today, I put it on my credit card. I can't afford IVF. I can't afford any of this." Silence filled the room. Julian got up slowly and walked to the window that overlooked Fifth Avenue, the city moving below, indifferent and brilliant in the afternoon light. She watched his reflection in the glass. And that was when she saw something she had not expected. He looked troubled. Not in a professional way. Not the careful empathy of a clinician. He looked like a man carrying something heavy, privately, for a long time, and this moment had somehow made it heavier. When he spoke again, his voice was quiet and deliberate. "What if I told you I have a way to help you, and that, in doing so, you would also be helping me?" She blinked. "I don't understand." He turned from the window and faced her with the same composed expression, but his eyes were different now. There was something almost tired in them. Something honest. "My grandfather built a medical empire worth $200 million. He left it to me on one condition: I must be married, and my wife must be pregnant, within 4 months. If I fail to meet either condition, the entire estate goes to a medical research foundation. His lawyers have made very clear that this is non-negotiable." Abigail stared at him. Her mouth had gone completely dry. "That's..." she started. "That's completely insane." "My grandfather was old-fashioned," Julian said, without any particular emotion. "He believed in family legacy above all things. He also believed that a man who could not build a family had no business running a family empire." He crossed his arms and looked at her directly. "You have 60 days. I have 4 months. I can provide the fertility treatment you need, all costs covered, the best medical care available. In return, you would become my wife on paper. Once you're pregnant, you carry the child you've always wanted. I secure the inheritance. When the legal conditions are fulfilled, we divorce. You walk away financially secure for life." Abigail sat very still. "You're proposing a business arrangement," she said, barely above a whisper. "A legal marriage," he said. "Real in every official sense. We would have to maintain appearances. But the pregnancy would be handled medically. You would remain, exactly as you are now. Your virtue is not part of this transaction." She should have stood up. She should have walked out. Every sensible, self-preserving instinct in her body was standing up, putting on its coat, and heading for the door. But she thought of her apartment in Queens. Of the bare walls and the second-hand furniture and the silence that pressed in every evening. She thought of the baby blanket her grandmother had knitted for her, pale yellow, soft as a sigh, stored in a box under her bed like a secret. She had kept it for years without knowing why. Maybe, some small stubborn part of her had always known. She thought of the dream. Of the little face she had imagined in quiet moments, brown eyes, maybe, or gray. Of the word "mama" spoken for the first time. She thought of the 60 days, ticking away like a clock she couldn't stop. "I want conditions," she heard herself say. His eyebrows lifted slightly. The first genuine surprise she had seen cross his face. "I'm listening. I keep my job. I'm not a kept woman. I want full transparency on every medical decision, I'm informed about every step of my treatment. And I want honesty. If we are going to live together and do this extraordinary, impossible thing. I want us to at least be honest with each other." He considered this for exactly 3 seconds. Then he extended his hand across the desk. "We have a deal." She looked at his hand. A surgeon's hand. Large and steady and careful, the kind of hand that had held human hearts and coaxed them back to beating. A hand that fixed broken things. She shook it. "Call me Abigail," she said. "If we're doing this, we start with honesty." The handshake lasted 3 seconds longer than it needed to. Neither of them mentioned it. She didn't know it yet. But that handshake, that quiet, trembling, 3-second too long handshake, was the beginning of something neither of them had planned for. Something neither of them had a contract for. Coming up in part 2, the wedding that wasn't, the mother-in-law who declared war, the cold penthouse where a baby blanket from Queens became the most powerful thing in the room, and the first moment Abigail Morrison realized that Dr. Julian Hartwell might not be quite as untouchable as he seemed. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back. If you're just joining us, pause, go back to part 1, trust me. And if you stayed, I need you to know that what comes next is the part of this story that will stay with you. Because anyone can make a contract. Anyone can sign papers and shake hands and pretend they understand the terms. What nobody tells you is what happens when two strangers begin to actually see each other. 1 week later, Abigail Morrison stood in a city clerk's office wearing the nicest blouse she owned, the pale blue one she'd bought on sale for a job interview 2 years ago. There were no flowers. No music. No guests, except 2 hospital staff members Julian had quietly recruited to serve as witnesses. People who did not know her name 20 minutes ago. The clerk's voice was monotone and practiced, moving through the vows like a man reading a grocery list. When she reached the part about rings, Julian produced a platinum band from his jacket pocket, simple, elegant, serious. He slid it onto Abigail's finger. It felt cold. It felt heavy. "You may kiss the bride." Julian turned to her. His gray eyes met hers for a brief, awkward moment, and they both made the same silent decision at precisely the same instant. He pressed his lips to her cheek. Warm. Brief. Careful. And then they were married. In the taxi to his penthouse, she turned her new ring around and around on her finger. Mrs. Abigail Hartwell. The name felt like a costume. Like she had borrowed someone else's life and was wearing it badly. "My mother will be at the penthouse when we arrive," Julian said suddenly, staring out the window. Oh. She hadn't known there was a mother. Of course there was a mother. "Does she know about our arrangement?" "She knows I married suddenly. She doesn't know why." A pause. "She's going to be difficult." Abigail looked at the side of his face. The clean line of his jaw. The faint tension there. This was a man who could deliver devastating medical news without blinking, negotiate $200 million inheritances without raising his voice, and yet the idea of his mother made his jaw tighten. There is something almost unbearably human about that, she thought. The penthouse occupied the top floor of a Tribeca building, and it was breathtaking in the way that things are breathtaking when they are designed to impress rather than welcome. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Manhattan. Everything was marble, glass, chrome, beautiful, cold, and precise. Exactly like its owner. Abigail stood in the entrance hall and felt like she was in a museum. She was afraid to touch anything. Catherine Hartwell was waiting in the living room. She was a woman who had clearly been beautiful in her youth and had since calcified that beauty into something more demanding, impeccable posture, silver blonde hair swept into a perfect twist, a cream St. John suit, pearls. Her blue eyes moved over Abigail the way a customs officer scans luggage, looking for something to confiscate. "So. You're the girl who trapped my son into marriage." The words landed like a slap. Precise. Practiced. Catherine Hartwell had clearly been waiting to deliver them. "Mother," Julian began. I want to understand what you did, Catherine continued, her voice soft and vicious in the way that only truly accomplished cruelty can be. What a woman without a last name, without a family, without even a college degree, does to convince a man like my son to walk into a clerk's office and sign his name next to hers. Abigail felt the familiar flush of shame rise in her throat. The apartment in Queens. The second-hand furniture. The credit card she'd maxed out on a single consultation. She felt all of it, bright and hot and accusing. But she also felt something else. Something quieter. Something that had been growing in her, slowly, since the moment she had sat across from a surgeon and said, "I want conditions." "I didn't trap him," Abigail said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "And I'm not after his money. I know that's hard to believe. I know you have no reason to believe it. But it's the truth." Catherine smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes and isn't meant to. "You married a rich doctor you'd known for a week because you really care about him. How lovely." She turned to Julian. "I will be watching," she said pleasantly. "The moment she gives me a reason, I will have our lawyers dismantle whatever arrangement you've made." And then she walked out, leaving behind a cloud of expensive perfume and something heavier, the particular chill of a woman who has decided you are the enemy. Julian exhaled slowly. "I should have warned you better. I should have gone to see her first. Why does she hate me? She doesn't even know me." "She hates anything she can't control," he said simply. "Change. Surprises. Anyone who might take her influence over this family." He picked up Abigail's suitcase, the battered one with the broken wool she'd been meaning to replace for 2 years, and carried it himself down the hallway. "Come on. I'll show you your room." The guest room was bigger than her entire Queen's apartment. King bed. Sitting area. A bathroom with a soaking tub the size of a small pool. Thick white towels folded in the manner of an expensive hotel. Fresh flowers on the nightstand. She suspected a housekeeper had placed them, not Julian, but she appreciated them anyway. Beautiful. And utterly empty. She sat on the edge of the bed and opened her suitcase. Folded clothes, a few books, her toiletries in a Ziploc bag. And at the very bottom, wrapped carefully in tissue paper, the baby blanket. Pale yellow. Soft as a prayer. Knitted with arthritic hands by a grandmother who had died 3 winters ago and had still believed, right up until the end, that Abigail would one day have the family she deserved. She laid the blanket across the foot of the enormous bed. It looked almost comically small in the grand space, a little flag of the real world, planted in the middle of all this marble and glass. But it made the room feel less lonely. Just slightly. "Treatment begins tomorrow," Julian said from the doorway. "We need to be at the clinic by 8. She turned to look at him, still in his suit, slightly loosened now, tie pulled just slightly away from the collar. In this light, with the Manhattan skyline behind him through the window, he looked less like a perfectly composed physician and more like a man who was quietly exhausted. "What if it doesn't work?" she asked. "What if my body doesn't respond?" He was quiet for a moment. Something moved through his eyes, fast, like a shadow, and she couldn't name it. Uncertainty, maybe. Or something that looked, briefly, like fear. "Then we find another way," he said. "I don't give up easily, Abigail." It was the first time he had said her name without it sounding like a formal address. Just her name. Simple. Like it had always belonged in his mouth. She noticed. She was the kind of person who noticed things. After he left, she touched her stomach gently, the way women do when they are speaking to something that isn't there yet. She whispered a quiet prayer to whoever might be listening, not entirely sure they were, but willing to try anyway. Then she touched the yellow blanket. Felt her grandmother's hands in it, somehow. Felt something like courage stitch itself quietly back into her chest. Tomorrow, she thought. Let tomorrow be the beginning. The treatments began. The days passed. And somewhere in the precise, clinical rhythm of injections and appointments and careful professional distance, something unplanned began to grow, not just in Abigail's body, but between two people who had signed a contract believing that contracts could define the limits of a human heart. They were both about to discover how wrong they were. Part 3 is the part 1 need you to stay for. Because that is where everything changes. Where the deal breaks open. Where the truth, messy and uncontracted and entirely inconvenient, finally walks through the door. Here is what nobody tells you about living with a stranger. After enough shared mornings, after enough coffee cups left on the wrong counter, enough 6 a.m. departures and late-night returns, enough small silences that stop being awkward and start being simply quiet, a stranger becomes something else. Something your life begins to shape itself around, the way water shapes itself around stone. Abigail hadn't planned on that. Julian, she suspected, hadn't planned on it either. The injection started on a Tuesday. Julian drove her to the clinic himself, every single morning. She had not asked him to. He had simply appeared in the kitchen at 7:30, keys in hand, coat already on, with 2 travel cups of coffee he had made himself because she had once, in passing, mentioned that she took hers with oat milk and no sugar. He had remembered that. She didn't know what to do with that. The treatments were hard. Her body reacted strongly to the hormones, fatigue that settled into her bones, nausea that came in waves, headaches that pressed behind her eyes like hands. There were days when she came home from work and lay down fully clothed and simply didn't move. On one of those evenings, she woke in the dark to find a glass of water on her nightstand. A cold cloth folded beside it. The window cracked just slightly, the way she preferred it. He hadn't said anything about it in the morning. Neither had she. They began having dinner together, at first because it was easier logistically, then because it had become, somehow, the best part of both their days. He told her about cases, speaking carefully around patient privacy, and she found herself leaning forward to listen. She told him about the numbers she untangled all day at work, the small satisfying logic of accounts balancing, and he listened with the same focus he brought to everything, like she was the most interesting person in the room. She didn't think anyone had ever listened to her like that. It was on a Wednesday evening, 6 weeks in, that she found him. She had come home late from work to find the penthouse quiet. She went to the kitchen for water and noticed the light on in his study. The door was open just slightly. She meant to walk past. She didn't. Julian was sitting at his desk, his suit jacket over the chair, sleeves rolled to his elbows, and he was staring at a photograph. She couldn't see it clearly, but she could see his face, and his face was not the face of Dr. Julian Hartwell, composed and controlled and unreachable. It was the face of someone grieving. She pushed the door open, gently. He looked up. For just a moment, before the composure slid back into place, she saw everything. The exhaustion. The loneliness. The weight of a man who had spent his entire adult life being exactly what was expected of him and had never once asked what he actually wanted. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I didn't mean to intrude." "You're not." A pause. "Come in." She sat in the chair across from him. The photograph was face down now. She didn't ask. "Do you ever feel," he said quietly, and she could tell from his voice that he was surprising himself, saying this, "like you have spent your whole life doing everything correctly, and somehow ended up with nothing that actually matters?" She looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," she said. "I feel like that quite a lot." Something in his face softened. Not the professional, managed softness he used with patients. Something realer. Something that had no protocol. They sat in that study until nearly midnight, talking. Not about the treatment. Not about the inheritance. About their childhoods. About what they had wanted, once, before the world started telling them what they should want instead. She told him about her grandmother and the yellow blanket and the dream of a Sunday morning that smelled like pancakes. He told her, quietly, carefully, like a man handling something fragile, about a boy who had wanted to be a painter, once, before his grandfather had made very clear that the Hartwell legacy required a doctor. "The painting or the medicine?" she asked. "If you could go back." He looked at her steadily. "That's the first time anyone has ever asked me that." The news came on a Thursday morning, 53 days into their arrangement. Dr. Chen from the clinic called at 8 a.m. while they were both in the kitchen. Abigail's hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the phone. Julian stood across the kitchen island, watching her face, not moving. She listened. She said thank you. She hung up. She looked at him. She opened her mouth. No words came. So instead, she burst into tears. Julian was around the island in 2 steps. And she, who had been so careful, so measured, so determined to keep the terms of their arrangement clean and professional, turned toward him and pressed her face against his chest like it was the most natural thing in the world. He held her. His arms came around her without hesitation, without calculation. One hand rested against her hair. Neither of them moved for a long time. "It worked," she finally managed, her voice muffled against his shirt. "Julian. It worked." She felt him exhale, a long, slow breath, like a man releasing something he had been holding for years. "I know," he said quietly. "I know." And she would think about it later, the certainty in his voice. Not relief. Not triumph. Something gentler than both of those. Something that sounded, to her careful ear, remarkably like love. But of course, nothing that beautiful comes without its storm. Catherine moved quickly. She had apparently been gathering information for weeks, scrutinizing Abigail's background, her salary records, the timing of the marriage. She arrived at the penthouse on a Sunday morning with a lawyer and a stack of papers she claimed would expose the arrangement as fraudulent and void the inheritance entirely. She stood in the living room with the confidence of a woman who had never once lost. "I have everything I need," she said crisply. "The terms of fathers will specify a genuine marriage. Not a transaction. Not a contract signed in a fertility clinic. This will be dissolved and the estate will transfer appropriately." Abigail stood very still. Julian stepped forward, and she had never seen him look like this. Not composed. Not clinical. Not controlled. He looked, for the first time since she'd known him, completely and entirely certain. "You want to know if this marriage is genuine, Mother? Then let me tell you something genuine." He turned and looked at Abigail. And everything in his face, all of it, the gray eyes, the jaw she had come to know, the hands that had quietly left cold cloths on her nightstand, was open in a way she had never seen before. "I am in love with my wife," he said clearly. "That wasn't part of the arrangement. It wasn't part of anything I planned. But there it is. And if you want to take the inheritance, take it. I am not going to pretend otherwise." The room was completely silent. Abigail's heart was doing something extraordinary in her chest. She crossed the room. She took his hand. She looked at Catherine Hartwell, who was looking at them both with an expression that was cracking, slowly, at the edges. "We didn't plan this," Abigail said quietly. "Neither of us did. But the things that matter most rarely come from plans, do they?" Catherine's lawyer shuffled papers that no one was looking at. Catherine looked at her son. And whatever she saw in his face, whatever mother's instinct still lived beneath the armor, made her put her hand to her mouth. Just for a moment. Just enough for Abigail to see it. She left without another word. The lawyer followed. The door closed softly. Later, much later, after the baby arrived, after the inheritance was secured, after Catherine Hartwell attended the baby's naming ceremony and held her grandchild with hands that trembled with something besides coldness, Abigail would be asked how she knew. How did she know that what started as a transaction had become something real? The blanket, she would always say. On the morning after Julian told his mother the truth, Abigail had come into the living room to find him sitting on the couch, the yellow baby blanket across his lap, the small, handmade, out-of-place thing from Queens that had survived every version of this story. He was running his thumb across the stitches. He didn't see her watching. "It's beautiful work," he said when he heard her. "Your grandmother made this?" "She believed I'd need it someday," Abigail said. He looked up. Those gray eyes, full and warm and nothing like the careful, composed face she'd first seen across a clinical desk. "She was right," he said. And he held out his hand. She took it. And somewhere in a pale yellow blanket, the dream her grandmother had knitted into existence was finally, quietly, coming true. This story, of a 21-year-old girl who walked into a fertility clinic with 60 days and an empty credit card, and walked out with a life she never imagined, is a reminder of something we sometimes forget when the world feels very big and very cold. Desperation, when it is honest, can be a doorway. And love, real love, doesn't arrive on schedule. It doesn't follow contracts. It doesn't fit neatly in a manila folder. It arrives in cold cloths left on nightstands. In oat milk coffee remembered without being asked. In a man who looked at a painting he gave up and a woman who saw it anyway.